Okay, nature lovers, today we're going to talk about the internal assessment. I know you've all been worried about this and wanting to work on this, so we are going to spend I'm guessing about a month on this. So we've got a good unit ahead of us. By the end, we'll have three or four IAs under our belt and pick the best stuff and have hopefully kind of a good time as we go. Okay, in case you don't know, the internal assessment is essentially where you set up a couple of different experiments. I give you a prompt that's very open-ended, and it's up to you to figure out the test. So I'm going to teach you some basics over these next few videos, and you're going to use those basics and the knowledge you've learned about ecosystems and combine those to design experiments that you can test. We'll talk about limitations. We'll talk about things like that in class. But for the most part, this is you. It's very much up to you. So I'm going to give you the basics, and like I said, then you have to razzle dazzle me. All right. You have to do 2 of these that are officially turned in, by the way. But they don't. All the different parts don't have to come from the same IA. So let me show you what I mean by parts. So the first part is the design element. Okay. You have to design the experiment, and I'm going to break this down in just a few minutes, but we'll go over the whole thing here. The second part is data collection and processing, and you have to go out. You actually have to do this experiment. You have to collect the data. You have to process the data. Again, we'll talk about that. And from that, you have to write a conclusion and an evaluation. And I'll just say, and I'll say this probably 100 more times, evaluation is what is going to make or break this enchilada for you. Okay. If you do a crappy evaluation and give vague and broad answers, they're not going to accept it. I'm not going to accept it. If you give concise, well thought out evaluation, that's the way to go. You'll be a winner. Okay, so hang on just a second. Bill's texting me. Okay, I'm back. That was Bill. We've got it worked out. All right, so let's get rid of these guys. And let's focus first on design, okay? Okay, so design is our first element that we're going to focus on. They call it, I don't know what they call it, but they break design down into aspects. So let me show you first aspect. The first aspect of design is defining the problem and selecting variables. And what I want to do is I want you to make kind of a flow chart out of all this where you have aspect and the definitions of each aspect right there with you so that you can kind of see it on a big piece of paper. And I'll probably give you the piece of paper so you can write all this out. And you can show me that you've done it so that I know you understand this process. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm going to make a video about each part. So I'll make a design video, I'll make a data collection and processing video, and I'll make a conclusion and evaluation video. But that way, we'll break it down, you'll know all the parts, you'll have this as a reference, and you'll be in good shape. So, just so you get this, the first thing you're going to do with aspect 1, you're going to define the problem selecting variable, and select variables, I should say select. But here's what that means. That means you have to formulate some sort of problem or research question. And that's not a hard thing to do. I'll show you how to do that. The hard part is finding one that's really within your grasp to test. You know, just making up a good research question, not that hard. Do we have the stuff or do you have the time to actually test it? That's a little harder, so you have to evaluate that. And then once you do that, you have to identify what the actual relevant variables are, your independent and dependent control variables. And again, I think you can do that fairly easily. I'll teach you how to do that. Okay, which takes us to aspect 2. Aspect 2 is actually controlling your variables. Okay, so once you've identified your independent and dependent variables, everything else is a control variable. We'll have to talk about that. We'll talk about making experimental groups and control groups, and then everything else will control with the variables. So this is what they want you to do. They say you should be able to design a method for the effective control of variables. So if the temperature needs to stay the same, you have to have a method to tell us how you're keeping the temperature the same. If the amount of light stays the same, you have to tell us how to do that. You have to tell us how you're controlling all the variables. Okay, that's the tricky part. Aspect 3 is developing a method for collecting data. Now, I think here's what they say you have to be able to do. You need to be able to develop a method that allows for the collection of sufficient relevant data. Here's that relevant is the key word right there, okay? Because really, it's you can collect all sorts of data. But if it's not really pertaining to your problem or your research question, then it's a waste of time. You can also collect data and get not enough. So you've got to figure out how much do you need to get good numbers. And we will talk about all this. But so sufficient and relevant are the two key words here. You need to be able to do that. Okay? So there's aspect 1, aspect 2, aspect 3. You have to do all three of these tasks to get good marks in the design part. If you don't do that, then you get not as good. If you do it well, you get 2 points for this, 2 points for this, 2 points for this. You want all 6 points. If you do it okay, you might get 2 points for doing well here. You did this really okay, so you get 1 point. This you did a crap job on, so you get 0 points, and so you end up getting 3 out of 6. It's not a great IA. And that's only the first part. There's 3 parts, so you get 3 out of 6 on your first part of the IA, and we'll see about the rest later. Okay, so this is the design element. We're going to move on to the next, but on your paper you should have internal assessment, maybe a little arrow over here for design, and then under design aspect 1, 2, and 3, what they are, and a little bit of detail about each one. If you have that, you are set and ready to go to part 2. This might be a great time to jot down questions if you have them for me, you know, and so we can talk about them. Okay? All right, go ahead, I'll wait. Got it? Okay, excellent. On to the next. So the first aspect in data collection and processing, which is kind of the actual doing the experiment, right, is you have to record your raw data. That's the first aspect. And this is, you don't manipulate it at all. You don't average anything. You don't find the percent of anything. You don't do anything. You just write down your results. Okay, of course, let's see how they put it. Record appropriate quantitative and associated qualitative raw data. Basically what that's saying is, quantitative is numbers, things you can measure. These are things, qualities of something. So it's a little bit more descriptive. This can be very good data. It's a little harder to replicate or to substantiate. So scientists love quantitative data, even though qualitative data can be very helpful. It's ambiguous, and scientists don't love ambiguity. So this is usually first, but this is a good backup. Okay, you got to include your units and uncertainties where relevant, so things that could cause a problem. That's probably less for what we're doing. You don't have to worry about a ton of this, but we'll talk about that. Aspect 2, once you have your raw data collected and recorded, you have to process it. And this is statistics. In a nutshell, statistics. Maybe you average it, maybe you do a t-test, maybe you do a chi-test, maybe you go get chi and then do a t-test. Anyway, this is kind of your whole process of turning those numbers. Basically, the way I always like to say it is data tells you a story. You don't always know what that story is by looking at raw data, so you have to find the story that the data is trying to tell you, and to find it, you do different statistical tests, and eventually the story will reveal itself. How's that for getting all metaphysical and funky? But that's the truth. That's how I look at it. All right, aspect 3. Once you have found the story in the data, then you have to present what you found. The most common way we do this is with a graph. Sometimes they do other data tables. Sometimes they do other methods of showing it. But really, we're usually, I bet 8 times out of 10, we're talking about a graph. Okay, and different kinds of graph depending on what we're looking at, but graphs. So you present the process data appropriately, and where relevant, you include your errors and uncertainties. Okay, that really could say, graph me, graph me. Anyway, so we'll talk about how to graph. We'll talk about how to make a good data table. We'll do all that stuff so that you're sure you get it. Hopefully it'll be reviewed, but we'll still talk about it. Okay, so that is the second part, data collection and processing. So if you're making a nice, I think, remember, like, kind of, you should be set up with design here and conclusion and evaluation here in the middle, and then under it, put this stuff that I'm talking on your paper. So you have this nice chart. That's what I'm hoping for here, okay? All right, so, or I'm sorry, this goes over here. So anyway, with that said, that pretty much wraps up data collection and processing. So let's move on to conclusion and evaluation. So aspect one of this is concluding, right? Pretty simple, conclusion, concluding. And what they expect you to do here is state a conclusion with justification based on a reasonable interpretation of the data. So this kind of goes back to what I'm saying about data tells you a story, and you have to find that story, and that takes a little work. That's kind of the whole trick, right? What's the story the data's telling you? Well, here's where you tell that story. This is what the data told me when I did this. I found it by doing this, and here's why I think what I think. And that's a big part. That's a big part. This is definitely kind of tough thinking and really picking through it. We'll go into it in some detail, but this is a tough step, but it's an important step. Now, what you also do is you evaluate your procedure. So you look for weaknesses and limitation, maybe time or materials, or maybe you designed it poorly. Once you got in there and did it and said, you know, oh, I wish if I would have done this, I could have found stuff better. Or maybe you did some research while you were working on this and found a better technique. And you could explain why this new technique would be better than the old technique. This would be where you would do that. And man, IB loves evaluations. They love it when you can show that you have that evaluating skill and that you don't just talk crap. Okay? So this is another important part. It's not going to be a huge part, but it's an important part. And then finally, you take that information and you tell us how you would improve the investigation next time. Okay? This is completely based on this. So suggest realistic improvements with respect to identified weakness and limitations. This should be a discussion based on this. So next time I'm going to do this because of this. Whoops, sorry. Because of this. That's the deal. That's what this step is about. And if you don't base it on this, they don't want to know. Okay? So we'll talk about that in more detail. So in conclusion, we have conclusion and evaluation. We have data collection and processing. And we have design. And these are those three elements that make a good IA. And we will now, if you understand all this, you can move on to the next video, which is about design. And then the next video will be this, and the next video will be that. And then you should have a pretty good understanding of what should go into an IA. The next thing will be practicing and actually doing it and evaluating how well we did it. Well, if you have questions, please write them down. Talk to me in class. If you don't have questions, then move on to the design video. Let's get that sucker going. All right. Take care. Have a great day. Ciao.